too short. I can't see you. If I put my Bible in there, I can't see it.
I don't know where I thought it was too tall for you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So this evening, we're going to start on the book of Esther. And if you recall last time when Mike was here, we did Ezra. And the next one in order in the Bible is Nehemiah. But Esther actually falls in between those two books. So we're going to do Esther tonight. And I don't know how many lessons Mike's going to do on Esther, but we're going to, what do you, yeah, she's wearing her Esther shirt. Good deal. I had no idea what you were doing. And so, Esther is a very, very interesting book. But first and foremost, first and foremost, you need to understand that Esther is not a Disney movie story. It's not a love story about a young orphan girl who becomes a princess and lives happily ever after. That is not the story of Esther. A lot of times in our little kids' classes, we teach Esther kind of like that. That's not the story of Esther. Another thing that is not Esther, which I kind of have to struggle with because I really like this about Esther. Esther is it's written very chronologically, as opposed to most books in the Bible are a little bit different than that, but it's very chronological. And the one really cool thing about the book of Esther is the good people win and the bad people get punished really bad. And I like that, and I should not, because that's what Jonah did. And so I just want to tell you, one of the lessons that you should not get from Esther is to be happy when the good people win and the bad people lose. That's not the point of the book of Esther. And I have to struggle with that. And so if I say that tonight and somebody say, nope, Scott, not the point, not the point. But what we're going to do tonight is kind of prepare for Mike to talk about lessons from Esther. So we're going to look a little bit about the history, a little bit about the book, kind of where it falls in history. And then we're going to talk a lot about the characters, the people in the book of Esther, and a little bit about their personalities. So the next couple of weeks when Mike does lessons on the book of Esther, you will have an idea about the personalities of these people, because these are very, very strong people. One of the first things is that we don't know who wrote the book. A lot of people think maybe Mordecai, however you want to pronounce his name, that maybe he wrote it, but we don't know that. It doesn't say that. But there's kind of some circumstantial evidence that would kind of point maybe to Mordecai or somebody like him writing the book. It falls, back when we were reading Ezra, the account of Esther falls in between approximately chapters 6 and 7. And there's kind of a gap. Mike said last week there was about a 70-year gap there. And that's where the account of Esther falls in. It's set in Susha, which is the capital city of the Persian Empire. And one of the things, there are a lot of the early historical or biblical scholars who did not want to put Esther in the canon. They didn't want Esther to be part of the Bible for a couple of reasons. One is, and we'll talk about this later, but Esther never mentions the name of God directly. It's just God's name is not in the book. Another reason is, other than the biblical evidence, there is no historical mention of Esther being a queen in Persia. There's no historical mention of that whatsoever. Nor is there any historical evidence about an attempt for anybody in Persia to execute the Jews that lived in Susha, which is kind of the book. And so historically, the only time we have any information about that is from the Bible. So because of that, some people would say Esther shouldn't be that. A lot of people claimed Esther was actually fiction, or at best, historical fiction. That's what they would claim about the book of Esther. And maybe it was written to be a justification for the Jewish celebration of Purim. And maybe somebody had concocted this story to justify why they have the celebration of Purim. But there's some really, really interesting things that through archaeology that have happened that kind of give a lot of credibility to parts of Esther. In the palace in Susha, and another one of the Persian palaces in a place that I can't pronounce, but it's spelled Persepolis, Persepolis, I guess. There have been some archaeological digs, and in those palaces, they have identified what they call the women's quarters. And if you're familiar with the book, and I'm sure most of y'all have read the book of Esther before, but if you're familiar with the book, there are women's quarters. It's where Esther goes when she enters the palace. She goes to the women's quarters. And in these archaeological digs from these two palaces, they have found these women's quarters. Another interesting thing is typically Persian kings only took queens from 7 noble families. There were only 7 families that Persian kings took their queens from. We know that there was one exception to this, and once again, I can't pronounce that name, but there was one exception to this. There is also no record of Xerxes. The king that we're going to have here is Ahasuerus or Xerxes the first. There's no record of who Xerxes' chief wife or chief queen was from the 7th year of his reign until the end of his reign. We don't have any historical record of that. That's the same time period that Esther would have been the chief queen. So we don't know that from outside the Bible that was Esther, but it falls in the right time frame. It fits. Esther would have fit in that when we don't have any record of somebody else being the queen. So you have a lot of instances like that. One really interesting thing that I found, so I'm just going to read this. French archaeologists excavated at Susa intermittently from 1897 to 1979. And thanks to their efforts, the palace at Susa has been significantly studied and preserved. Their findings have demonstrated that the author of the book of Esther was intimately familiar with the palace's layout. The descriptions of specific rooms and locations in the biblical text align remarkably well with what has been uncovered through the excavations. The details of the book of Esther are so precise that one can identify the exact places where the key events occurred using a simple Google Earth image of the palace. There is actually a Google Earth image of the palace at Susa. I think there are 3 Google Earth images of palaces in that part of the world, and one is the palace at Susa. And you can go to that Google Earth and you can see, and they have labeled, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, or something like that, the places that are mentioned in the book of Esther, and they fall exactly where they are represented to be in the book of Esther. So all of that said, there are a lot of people that give a huge amount of credibility to the book of Esther, not as fiction or even historical fiction, but as an absolute true narrative of what happened then. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence, although the name of Esther is not in any historical record we found yet other than the Bible, nor the attempt to remove the Jews from Susha. So we have a lot of evidence. And obviously this is a discussion class, so if anybody has anything to add to that or like a question or anything, please feel free to do so at any time. Okay, and then like Mike said, Esther happens between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra, and then Nehemiah follows after that. So what I thought we'd do for the vast majority of the time, is to look at the people who are the characters who make up the story of Esther, because it's the people and it's their personalities and their human attributes that make the story come together. So who's the first person that you think of in the book of Esther? Who? Esther. I mean, you're wearing a shirt. I mean, you've got to say that, right? So who was Esther? Where's the first place that you read about Esther? I think in chapter 2, verse number 7, you read, and she's not called Esther. What is she called? Hadassah? I can't say that. But who is she? She's a Jewish girl, right? So why are the Jews here? Why are the Jews in Persia? Because we've been studying from Mike's lessons that in Ezra, the kings allowed the Jews to leave and go back to their homeland, right? That's what we've studied the last couple of weeks. So why is Esther and her family still in Persia? They didn't go. I don't know why, but they did not leave Persia. They stayed. So she's a Jewish girl. She's also an orphan. I think it tells us that her parents were killed, or they died. Her parents are dead. And she is under the guardianship of a man named Mordecai. And he is either, based upon what commentary you read, he's either her uncle or her cousin. That's what most people tend to think. But anyway, he is under her guardianship. So she is a young lady. What else do we know about Esther? See, all the teenage boys left. And so this is the first thing that, if I were them, if a teenage boy, the first thing I would have picked up, what? She's beautiful. She is unbelievably beautiful. And so we know that about Esther. What else do we know about Esther's character or her personality? She does. She's a Jew. She keeps her identity of a Jew as a secret, but we know that she loves the Jewish people, and we're going to see that in there. What else do we know about her? We know that eventually she becomes part of the harem, right? Part of the king's women. And this is the part that's not a fairy tale. It's not a Disney story. And we haven't talked about Xerxes yet, but we'll talk about him next. Xerxes is a terrible, terrible human being. He's a vile, vile person. And from what I've read about, he when he took the women into his harem, or the women's quarters, then what he did was he would invite them one at a time over some period of time into his bedroom at night, and he would have sexual intercourse with them. Historically, he has a very big sexual appetite, evidently. And if he liked them, then they would go on this side. If he didn't care for them, they would go over here, but they never went back to their families. And they never got away from the palace. They became part of his harem that he never had interaction with again, but they were just trapped. They became slaves. Xerxes treated all these women as his property. That's the way he looked at them. There's several occurrences that we'll read about that. But if he liked them, they would go over here, and he might call them back at some point in time. So keep that in mind when we're thinking about the story as well. So in chapter 2, verse number 15, what does it say about Esther? That's where it talks about her being the uncle. Let's see. There's another place. Yeah, at the end of 15, at the end of 2:15, it says, "Now Esther was winning the favor in the eyes of all who saw her." So Esther not only wins favor from eventually the king and some other people in the palace, but evidently there was something about Esther that made everybody favor her. What do you think that might be? So whose name is not mentioned in the book of Esther? God. So why do you think everybody that Esther came in contact with favored her? So who do you know, or who in here, everybody that you know favors you? Who's like that in here? You? Did you raise your hand? No, okay. So, who do you know that everybody likes? I don't know anybody like that. There's nobody like that. So for that to happen, everybody that she met, it says all who meet her, they favored her. Had to be God, right? Had to be a God thing. I think one of the lessons Mike's had lately is about the hand of God being on things. It doesn't say that, but that's what it is here. God is helping Esther through his providence. So you have that about Esther. A couple other things about Esther. She listens and takes advice very well. Who does she get advice from? Mordecai. Who else? We'll talk about him in a minute. The eunuch that's in charge of the women. His name is Haggai. Yeah. She takes advice from him. It's a really important part of the story, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. One of the other things that she does, and we're going to talk about Ahasuerus next, or Xerxes next, but he had a lot of vices. In her manipulating him, she uses the vices that he has, because remember, what does she do? She invites him to a party or a banquet. He likes banquets. She gets him drunk. He likes to drink a lot. She makes him angry. He gets angry really quick. And she uses all the things that he naturally does. And she uses all those things. So I would tell you that she's actually very perceptive as well. And so that's kind of a summary of Esther. Anything else about Esther that you see? What else do you see about Esther? Or maybe you don't see some of those things. Maybe you don't. Anything else? Okay. So let's look at Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. He was the Persian king, and he reigned from 486 to 465. And history calls him Xerxes the First. And just some of the things I wrote down about him, he is easily persuaded by other people. He makes decisions quickly, uninformed, and rashly. He considers his kingdom and his people to be his property, disposable at his will. He is a military king. And historically, he's known for his lavish banquets, his drinking, his temper, and his sexual appetite. And you see that in the very first event. Yes, sir? Ahasuerus, yes. One is the Hebrew name and one is the Greek, Persian name, I think. But yeah, Xerxes the First and Ahasuerus are the same person. And like when we talked about Esther a minute ago, Hadassah and Esther are the same person. So, same people. Good question, though. And so, one of the interesting things about Xerxes is there was a movie out several years ago called The 300. And so, any of you see the movie The 300? It's a rough movie. It's a really, really bloody movie. And it's about when Persia, or it's when the 300 Spartans stood in the pass at Thermopylae, is that right? And the Persian king, who is Xerxes the First, it's this Xerxes, was trying to attack them. He wins that battle eventually, or he wins that battle, but eventually the Persian army is pushed back and he has to go back, and he goes back home. And so this is the king, Xerxes, that is depicted in the movie The 300. Historically, this is Xerxes the First. This is who this is. The events of Esther, most scholars think, happen within a few years after he comes back from his failed military battle. He comes back and he's having all these, historically they say, after he fails in his battle, he comes back and he starts building projects that his father had started. Finishing the palace at Susa, finishing some other building projects. And it's during this time that he has the banquet, invites Vashti, his current queen, to come up. She refuses, and then the story of Esther starts. So we think that's when this all happens. And so, but this is the king that you have, Ahasuerus. Like I said, he's a bad person. He's a very, very, very bad person. I don't know that history talks about many redeeming characteristics that he has. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Which would have, right, which would have fit his character. I mean, that falls right in with his character. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's also interesting that the name Vashti is also not in the historical record any place. But there's another queen that, and I can't remember what her name was, but they say that her Hebrew name, Greek name, Persian name, linguistically you could get Vashti out of that. So there might be some occurrence historically that might come up with that queen. But yeah, and so this is who Xerxes is. And so as you read the book, as Mike goes through lessons and you read about Xerxes, just think about anytime you have something with him, think about why he's making this decision. He makes rash decisions. He makes quick decisions. He makes angered decisions. He does this over and over and over. This is who he is. He's this all the time. And it's interesting to me that Esther uses that she uses his character to gain what she needs, which is a really, really interesting thing. So overall, I would just tell you, he's as bad, to me, he's as bad as Ahab and Jezebel. He is a terrible, terrible character and person in the book. Very, very, very bad. And so we have the queen, the former queen, Vashti, whatever you want to call her. What do we know about her? What is the one thing she has in common with Esther that also we know that the king really likes? She's beautiful too, right? I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it doesn't say this, but there's nobody in that palace that doesn't look really, really pretty. That's just the way he was. And Vashti was evidently a beautiful, beautiful queen. And like she said, she was invited to come before the banquet. How long had the banquet been? In chapter 1. How long had that banquet been? Well, that's the second banquet. The first banquet was 6 months. They had a 6-month banquet, and at the end of the 6-month banquet, Xerxes says, let's party for 7 more days. And during that 7 days, with all of his friends there, is when he requests for Vashti to come and present herself, and she refuses. So somebody find chapter 1, verses 16 through 19. It's not really about Vashti, but I think this is so interesting because we have this occurrence where Vashti refuses. He gets really upset, and he goes to his inner circle and he says, "What are we supposed to do? Because we can't let her do this. She can't do this to the king." What do they come back and say to him? Somebody read 16 through 19. So what did his inner circle say? They said, "Bless your heart, we're so sorry she did that to you, but if we let this stand, they're going to do that to us." That's what they said. So his inner circle that he had so much trust and faith in, maybe they weren't quite as concerned about her not presenting herself as the king requested as they had her setting a precedent, and all the other women were going to do that. And they were really upset about that. And like I said, not really about Vashti, but I just think that, I've always thought that's a very interesting thing. And once again, you have this group of people who are making a decision. They're saying this, but really and truly, the reasoning is this. It's an ulterior motive. We don't want our women doing that to us. So the king better do something. So that's who Vashti is. So we talked about Esther. So we also have Esther's uncle or cousin named Mordecai. And so we have him in here. And I think the first time you read about him is actually in chapter 2, verse number 7. And I think we may have already read that. It says, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. So we have this man who has taken in Esther to raise as his own daughter. And so we have him. So what are some of the, as you think back on the book, so what are some of the characteristics, human characteristics of Mordecai? What do we know about him? He takes care of his family, right? He stands up and he takes care of his family. It's a very good attribute. What else do we know about him? I would say he's very smart. I would say he's a very, very smart person. He's very observant. He's very watchful. He pays attention to what's going on. He's also very humble. He's a humble person. It appears to me that he's content, maybe even prefers to live and perform in the background. I think it could be said of him that he understands his role, which is one of the awesome lessons of the book of Esther, is that each of us have a role. Mordecai's role was not, he could not present himself to the king. He had no standing with the king, but he knew somebody who did. And so he was an encourager to her. In your life or in my life, as I go through my life, I might not always be an Esther, but I can be a Mordecai. If I find the person who has the access, who can do something, I might be able to be the person who can help them, to influence them, to give them the strength to do what they need to do for the good of all of us.
The way he kept in contact with her was showing how much care he had for her.
Mm-hmm.
Because they couldn't have personal contact, but he walked around and
Right. And they would use messengers, and he would use messengers and send back and forth messengers to them. He's just there's a lot of good things. He's loyal to the king, even though it wasn't his king, right? It's a Persian king, but he's loyal to him. How do we know that? There was a plot one time to assassinate the king, and he heard about it. He sent word. They foiled the plot, killed the guys, which brings up something really, really interesting. So how did Xerxes the First, how was he eventually killed in, what year did we say? 46? 45? 465? How was he eventually killed? You know, he was killed by his bodyguard. A plot. There was a plot, a successful plot to kill him, which gives a little bit of credibility to if somebody killed him with a plot here, it's not unlikely that there were other plots before this. I mean, you know, if somebody tries to assassinate a political figure, they probably don't just try once. And so,
there's not many episodes of these people being killed in the verses that don't show some of the inner circle.
yeah, most of the time.
Brothers even get it.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I think when Xerxes was killed in 465, he was killed, and his immediate son, who would have been the king, and Artaxerxes becomes the king. He's actually like the second or third son, because the first heir was executed as well by his bodyguard. And so, yeah, you have he's very loyal to the king. The other thing that we know about Haman is Haman loved God. And he loved God so much. I mean, not Haman, Mordecai. Mordecai, yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Mordecai loved God. He loved God so much that he would not bow down to Haman. And Haman is the villain of the story. But he would not bow down. There's no way that he would bow down to Haman, because he knows that you only worship the true and living God, who's not named in the book. But his presence is there. His presence is there over and over and over. So that's who Mordecai is. So then we come to the quintessential villain of the story, Haman. And Haman is one of the chief advisors to the king. And so what are some of the personal characteristics of Haman? Yes. Yeah, all of those things. Selfish, self-centered, evil, conniving, all of those things. Haman is all of those things. He uses his power for his own personal advancement. He takes advice, bad advice. Once again, he's kind of like the king. He makes decisions without all the information. You know, the story of when he has to go and honor Mordecai. You know, he thought he had all the facts, but he didn't have all the facts. And so, but you have all of those things. Another thing that he had was he had a consuming hatred of the Jews and Mordecai. He hated them so much. That's all he cared about. There's a passage in chapter 5, starting in verse number 9. It's when he plans to hang him. And said, his day started out, said he went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. And nevertheless, Haman restrained himself. He went home. He went and got his friends and his wife. And he recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions which the king had honored him with, and how he advanced him above all the other officials and all the servants of the king. And he said, even the queen Esther, let no one come with the king to the feast as she has prepared, but tomorrow I'm invited by her together with the king. Yet all of this is worth nothing to me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He said, I've got all these things. He said, I've got riches, I've got possessions, I've got sons, I have everything, but all of it's void as long as I see Mordecai, that Jew, sitting at the king's gate, and he won't bow down to me. He was consumed by that. He hated him so much. And that's who that's who Haman was. Haman was that kind of person. And so I would assume, just from reading and other things, that he would use people, and that he had no problem in using people to further his needs, to further his cause, to do anything like that. He's a despicable person as well.
Governor Goldman said he didn't get all the facts. When he didn't get all the facts, guess who got impaled on the pole?
Yeah. That's another really interesting thing. Let me say this, then I'll come right to you. You said he got impaled on a pole. The King James Version, to mine, the ESV, says that he prepared a gallows, and they call it a gallows, and that he was hanged. There are other historical records and other translations that actually refer to it as being impaled as opposed to being hanged. And so, not really sure which one it is, but either way, what he had planned for somebody else happened to him because of that. Yes, Wendy. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, because why would Mordecai, why would he care? Yeah, he goes and he names all the things that he has, all the positions, the power. He says, the king's done this to me, the king's done this. The queen has invited me. She didn't invite anybody else, but she invited me. But yet, I can't be happy about that because there's this one guy who won't bow down to me. I guess another lesson that you could have is do we let that happen to us sometime? We forget about all the good things that happen to us and all the things that we have and the health that we have and the cars that we have and just everything that we have in the time of history that we have been privileged to live in. And I had a flat today, so my life's just worthless. How many times do we do that to ourselves? And when we do, we're kind of being like Haman. And so, David, did you have something too? Yeah, look at the contrast between those two. What did Mordecai have in terms of possessions? He didn't live in his own country. He sat by the gate. So he's here. Haman is here. And which one of them has peace? Mordecai, because he knows God. I mean, there's just all kind of lessons in the book of Esther. I've taught Esther a few other times differently than this, but it's my favorite book in the Old Testament. Yes, sir. He did. He sure did not. That's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah. Right. How many times had Haman? No, how many times had Haman saved the king? Probably none. He didn't do anything but use the king. Yeah. Mordecai saved the king, and then because you know what? He understands it's not what it's about. Right. Yeah, when he couldn't sleep one night, and they went back and read it to him. And so, yeah, why couldn't he sleep? Maybe the unnamed God in that. One other person that I think is a really, really important person is in Esther 2, verses 8 and 9. It's the guy who was in charge of the women. His name is Hegai. Haggai, maybe. I think he's a really, really interesting person as well, because he takes favor in Esther as well. And he does a lot of things. He advances her above all the other women. And it's really interesting in, I think it's in 2 and 15, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her in as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised her to do. So when it came time for her to go and see the king, he came to her and he said, "This is what you do. This is how you present yourself to the king." So once again, she's really good at paying attention, taking advice, and following through with that advice. But I just think he's kind of an unsung person. He gives her really, really, really good advice. Then we have God, who we talked about, who's not mentioned in the book at all by name. But you see his providence, you see his power over and over and over and over and over in the book. And it's just a really, really interesting thing. So as I was studying for this last week, I read several things about Esther, several different commentaries or parts of commentaries and things like that. And there were a few things I thought were just kind of interesting. Like I said, Mike's probably going to take a couple of weeks, I would assume, and talk about lessons from the book of Esther. But I would suggest to you, as you read and probably reread the book of Esther in the next couple of weeks, a couple things to think about that I thought were really, really interesting. What commentary I wrote, their question was, is Esther a foreshadow of Jesus the Savior? Have you ever thought about that? Is she a foreshadow? Is she like Jesus the Savior? Because there are a lot of things that they have in common. She saves the people. She does it willingly. She does it in the face of death. She is sent from somebody higher than her, or more, she takes advice. So they make an argument that this could be one of the foreshadowings of Jesus. And so, I don't know. But think about that as you read about it. One of the more interesting things that I read about, and we're almost out of time, and the gentleman called it exile ethics. So how did the Jews live in exile and live in God's law? And he brings up, in this article, he brings up Mordecai. You could actually use Daniel. You could use Joseph. You could use, since Mike's not here, we're going to say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because I can't remember their other names. And so, but you can use those people were all living in exile. But they had, and this guy calls it exile ethics. So somebody look at Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7, and then verse number 14. And here Jeremiah is telling the people how to live in exile. Yes, sir? Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So what does it say in Jeremiah 29, 4 through 7?
Verse
29.
47.
Yeah, read it, Robert. So, and read verse number 14. Yes, sir.
I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortune and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place of which I have sent you into.
So, this is a summary of exile ethics that I thought was really cool. It said the exile ethics is not to be rebellious or subversive, but to remember which kingdom, nation, or empire in which we really reside. It is to be a God-fearing people dispensed in the world, it says, we are a God-fearing people dispensed in the world in which we live, but we understand that we belong to another kingdom. And you can look at that and you can think about that in terms of Joseph and Mordecai and Esther and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, and all those people lived in exile, but they still obeyed God, but they didn't try to overthrow the countries. They didn't try to do anything. That wasn't their goal. That wasn't their goal because they knew that's not what it was. And the interesting thing is, the reality is, that's us. We live in exile. We live in a world, in a country that's not our home. This is not ours. And to me, the best summary, and then we're finished because we've gone over, the best summary is in Hebrews chapter 11, one of my very favorite verses. And these all died in faith. It's in Hebrews 11:13. Not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus made it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out of, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. And that's where we live. We live in exile, and we have to live with exile ethics. And so, any other questions or comments? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And and like I said, there's a great lesson in there for us. You know, these people lived in exile. We live in exile, but this is not our home. And so, and you know, then there's some really, and once again, I'm sorry we're over, but there's some really interesting questions, because as you read, think about, and so these are hard questions. Ask Mike next couple of weeks. Let him answer these hard questions. Why was it okay for Esther to use banquetings and drunkenness and anger to achieve what she wanted to achieve? Why was it okay for her to do that? I don't know the answers to those questions. I do know this, that sometimes we get confused and we apply reasoning from the Old Testament, a different law than we live in, to the law that we live in now. And we say, because this is what the law that we live under, we're going to hold them accountable for the law that we live under. And that's a mistake to do. You don't do that. Those are different laws. And there were different purposes. There was a different purpose for Esther saving the Jews then than for me living my life in Maybank, Texas today. I have a different purpose. And I think we have to make sure we don't confuse those. And so, that's it. So, yeah, we're way over. So, I'm sorry. So, good job, sir.